Okay, I think we will get started. People will continue to come in. Welcome to On the Park Bench, a public square conversation brought to you by the Congress for the New Urbanism. On the Park Bench presents interactive conversations with thought leaders in new urbanism and allied fields related to the built environment. Today we have New Urbanism 2.0 with Andres Duany, moderated by myself, Robert Steuteville. A couple of notes. Join us for CNU 35. CNU 35 will be in the Twin Cities of Minnesota, June 15th through 18th, 2027. Go to cnu.org/CNU35 to find out more. And it's never too early. It's not too early to plan for this great event. And consider getting CNUA accredited. Sign up for CNUA. The benefits of accreditation provides a marketable credential to employers and clients. CNU accredited professional certificate. Listing on CNU.org public member directory is CNU accredited. And it's a great refresher course for learning about all the different aspects of new urbanism. Go to www.cnu.org/get-involved/get-CNU accredited. And today we're going to talk about new urbanism. We're calling it New Urbanism 2.0. New urbanism has accomplished a great deal over the last 30 years, and it has become a powerful force in the real estate industry, helping to remake the built environment of the United States and beyond. But it also has evolved over that time. And we're going to talk about some of the doctrines and the practices of new urbanism, how they maybe need some rethinking. Andres Duany, one of the CNU founders, has some ideas on that. The ideas revolve around street grids and retail and garages and architectural style and the social scene of communities and more. Andres Duany is a founding principal of DPZ Co-Design. He's also one of the founders of the Congress for the New Urbanism. He is the author of several important planning books, including Suburban Nation, The Smart Growth Manual, and The New Civic Art. I'm Rob Steuteville, editor of CNU's Public Square, and I'm going to pass this along to Andreas just to talk about these things. And when he is done, we're going to try to spark a discussion among you all. If you have questions for Andreas or just want to make a point that you want him to respond to, please use the Q&A function of Zoom to ask your questions as they occur to you. And I'm going to stop sharing and let you take this away, Andreas.
Well, thank you, Rob, for arranging this also in such short notice. So a little bit about the 2.0, as it's really metaphorical. For all we know, we're at 4.0 or 5.0. But one of the things to bear in mind is the new urbanism, if we include the work of Leo Creer, is between 40 and 50 years old. In fact, Seaside is getting to be 40 years old. And there is a lot of feedback and a lot of observation, a lot of things that we have learned and things we have failed to learn. But above all, I want to speak about feedback, what we've learned, particularly DPZ, our firm. And I'd like everyone to bear in mind that if what I am saying you think is critical, please bear in mind I'm criticizing our own work. Now, if you happen to have done something like I'm describing as a failed experiment or a broken spear, whatever you want to call it, please take on the problem. But everything that I will be speaking about is something that we've learned from our own practice and most of which we're practicing already. Okay? Now, the timeline of 40 years, the new urbanism has been driven by several what Chris Alexander called power grids, and I outlined them in the my particular chapter in the new book recently published book on climate change, the CNU publication. I speak about 4 phases that have driven the movement very, very cunningly. I think we've been very good at this. I'm now going to propose that in this timeline, we are pretty clearly confronting three additional elements, or at least two additional elements, or perhaps we've always confronted them, but because they come into focus, especially politically. Number one is sustainability. We know that one. There's affordability, which has never been more powerful. It is literally driving. It's one of the great drivers of the coming election, the affordability of housing. And the third one is an original one of the CNU that we seem to have forgotten and overlooked, which is sociability. You know, that already the disease control, the Center for Disease Control, et cetera, has actually called social isolation a plague, a disease. So we are, in fact, partially, at least partially, all of this is within our toolkit. I would like to bring up the sociability, the affordability, and the sustainability, but with more focus about what we've done and what could be done. Okay, so remember, this is feedback from built work. I will be speaking very lightly on about 20 topics. I won't get till the end. Maybe we'll lead another meeting on about 20 topics, and this is going to be very difficult to follow. I am aware that the most successful presentations are the ones that are on a single topic. Like, for example, the one in the 15-minute city 2 CNUs ago, or perhaps the one on Calthorpe has been brilliant at this with his lectures on single topics like TOD, or the certain intersections that he's invented. He's excellent at a single topic lecture. And we did have, I think, a memorable lecture from the Harvard professors at the last CNU who studied the positive effects of Hope 6. Okay, this is not going to be like this. You will hardly be able to follow what I'm saying, and consider this to be an index, a kind of table of contents of things to be further discussed. Okay, now there is our movement has been praised by the Academy for one aspect, which is our charter. The fact that we've had principles as opposed to being relativistic has been kind of astonishing to the Academy. And less noticed has been that we've developed a doctrine. Okay, now a doctrine is different from principles. A doctrine is the response that you have to certain situations. As you know, religions have doctrines. The Catholic faith has a doctrine. The military have a doctrine. A doctrine are responses to situations that we engage. Okay, we've been great at that. We've had so many ideas about frontage and permeable front porches and alleys and garages in the back. We've been terrific with our doctrines. Many of them have been embedded in excellent codes, such as the SMART code. The problem is that our doctrines have become dogma. Now, dogma is absolute rigidity. For example, we know that our doctrine is two-way streets, but it means that we have no allowance, no tolerance for one-way streets. Our doctrine is that garages go in the back because they undermine the pedestrian frontage. We have no tolerance for a garage in the front. Now, these are slight misunderstandings, but nevertheless, they've closed our research down. When new ideas come in that contradict these doctrines, we think it's heretical. Now, I've personally been presenting these ideas that I'm about to show you for a while now, and the uptake is really quite negligible, not to say negative. But I'm going to try again and see if I can communicate them. But I think that as we become dogmatic, we actually become what our critics have always thought of us, which is to say that we're a bunch of dogmatic, closed-minded people. We haven't been, but we've become that, I believe. Okay? Now remember that the New Urbanism, the original thing about neo-traditionalism, which was our original name, was a movement, a cultural movement that basically was a pragmatism that says whatever works best in the long run. And many of the doctrines that we came up with were hybrids with suburbia. We understood that suburbia did some things well. In fact, that suburbia did many things well. and that we were going, and so did traditional cities. Traditional cities did some things well and some things not so well, and we combined them. We did that very, very smoothly. Okay, this pragmatism, I believe that the pragmatism has now been lost, and that we actually have entirely too much heresy that cannot be touched. You know, we really don't like landscape urbanism. We really don't like this or that. There are too many things that we automatically exclude. And I think we need to deal with them. And certainly I'm going to engage quite a few. Okay. Now, we've also diminished, looked too closely. We've sort of spiraled inwards as to what our sources were to be. We loved the 1920s, the first generation of developers. We loved the picturesque medieval cities. There are very few in this country, very many in Europe. There are many things that we focus in and we get better and better at doing. We're better and better at porches. We're better and better at traditional architecture. We're better and better at some things we've selected to be, in fact, models that we emulate. And we are unable, I believe, to look at some things that are happening now that are pretty astonishing. And I think we need to look at success wherever it is found. And I want to just mention 4 or 5 that have fascinated me for years, and I've tried as much as I could to do deep studies of them. I would like to actually point out, first of all, the Burning Man. What is that about? What is so miraculously wonderful about Burning Man that it creates so much sociability? Okay, that bears in mind some study. What can we learn from that? Another one is, for example, the Margaritaville. Margaritaville is a kind of development, a kind of theme development, which is the most successful for the last few years in the United States. What is it about Margaritaville that actually attracts so many people, that makes them so sociable? Well, we've certainly done very, very good studies of that to find out what is it that we can learn and bring in. There's Marfa, Texas. What's up with Marfa, Texas? Why do people drive 4 to 6 hours from distant airports through the desert to spend time in a place that's essentially a no place? It's a place that has virtually no correspondence with what the new urbanist architects are doing, or what the new urbanists, there's very little spatial definition. There's very little architecture of character. What is it about Marfa that is so fantastic? Another one that you may know I've been spending a lot of time on are the mobile home parks. And not only because they're inexpensive, that's not the reason that actually, that's not the sort of the miracle that we find in the mobile home parks. What I find astounding is that the ones that have visited as a pedestrian are actually substantially more sociable than the new urbanist communities that we've designed. What is it about the mobile home parks? What is it about the frontage? What is it about the land ownership? What is it about the urban pattern that makes it so socially successful? Well, I think we shouldn't preclude studying mobile home parks, just like we shouldn't preclude studying our own projects for their, with serious critique in mind, for their successes and failures. Okay, so remember, I am doing I'm making a critique of our own work. Don't take it personally, but actually do take it personally, because you probably actually, maybe you can arrive at the same conclusions. In order to organize this presentation, which has been scattered all over, notes for years, actually, I'm putting it down to certain levels of development. I'm going to speak first about the dwelling. Then I'm going to speak about the lot. I'm going to speak about the block. I'm going to speak about a new increment called the sector or the quarter. I'm going to speak about the neighborhood, which is the pedestrian shed. I'm going to speak about the town. And then I'm going to speak about certain cooperative sheds that have to do with sustainability. Almost certainly, I will not be able to get to them, but all of them are highly developed in one way or another in our current work or in books that have been written. For example, the cooperative sheds were developed with Korkut Anaran on the book that we wrote on sustainability. Okay, so we let us now engage this. Okay, Now, as far as the dwelling is concerned, one of the things I've noticed, and painfully so, is of the hundreds, if not thousands, of porches that have been generated by the DPC codes, they are very, very rarely inhabited. Very rarely inhabited. There are people hanging out in other kinds of frontages. They hang around in stoops. They hang around, for example, in something that we do have in our repertoire, but it's rarely used, which is called a terrace, which is a raised yard. So we need to study what's up with the frontage, with the porch, and what is it that we can do to actually create that sociability. Now, there's so many things that can be said about this. Steve Mouzon has done terrific studies on making the porch more sociable, or actually, in fact, more protected from the pedestrians so that one feels more comfortable relative to the passerby. Yes, he's done that study and so forth, but I think we need to question whether the porch works even as well as the second story terrace. Is the second story terrace not sociable? Is it not possible to see the activity from the second floor on the street front and look down and see the street activity, and in fact have a very lively contribution to the street from the second floor terrace? No, we don't do that. We hardly ever do that, because somehow we have a phobia to the flat roof. And we all say, oh, the flat roof, that's going to leak, we can't do it. Well, let me tell you, that's out of date. I don't even want to discuss whether flat roofs leak. They don't. Okay, it's just a fright that we deployed from the 1950s when roofs used to leak. Okay, so perhaps we should study the terrace. But there's something else that I noticed, particularly in COVID, which is the potential of the garage. Now, way back in Kentlands, I could already see that the amount of activity in the backyard alleys involving children and some adults was actually greater than that of the playgrounds that we designed. I'm speaking of 30 years ago. We could already see the alleys full of kids with the open garage doors, full of toys, full of balls, full of old couches, full of refrigerators and drinks. We could see the kids running around the alleys of Kentlands, and we could see our beautifully designed playgrounds empty. So what was that about? It actually confirmed when during COVID, I did an awful lot of walking through our neighborhood, and I could see, particularly this one lady, one neighbor, who had a very nice garage with tall ceilings and beautiful garage doors and an apron of parking, of pavement that was really nice. And she had turned her garage into an office. And she was the only person that we knew that they hadn't trashed their own house as a workplace, moving the computers into the living room, that drill, when we all started working at home. And I had the aha moment of saying, is the garage not the most interesting and flexible part of the house? Is it not, in fact, the one play that people have to basically fulfill their desires? Those desires, those socio-demographic segments that Todd Zimmerman and Lori Vogt spoke about. Is that not the most interesting convertible space of the house? And what would happen if the garage were actually made wider? Let us say not just 12 feet, but let us say 14 feet. If it were taller, 9 or 10 feet, if it had proper finishes like sheetrock, if it had a great garage door, and if it moved right up to the sidewalk, is that not the desired workplace? The place where we say, well, the home becomes the workplace, but the home also becomes the yoga studio. The home also becomes the extra bedroom. The home also becomes the caregiver's apartment. Why should the outbuilding be the only place that's convertible, the outbuilding in the back? So we began actually systematically studying the garage, not designed for cars. Sure, they happen to fit cars. And the appraiser recognizes that there's a 1 or 2 car garage in the house for purposes of appraisal. But that the ones that we design are actually conceived as something else, as a place that actually fulfills the own self-defined notion of happiness, which is really one of our, at least used to be, one of our primary targets, is how can we fulfill sort of the desire for human happiness as self-defined. And I find the garage to be actually the future loft, the flex space, the one that actually can become the most enlivening thing that can happen on a frontage. Okay, so let's talk about that garage. By the way, people think that, well, yes, garage doors have to be nicer. Of course, garage doors have to be nicer. Of course, you can't park in front. Of course, the setback has to be short. Okay, but if you want to know what a converted garage is like, look at the London Mews. The London Mews are all 100% converted garages, and they could hardly be more sociable. So let's have another look at the garage as that place. Now, related to this is the advent of the small electric vehicle, the small one, okay? Not just the car, the long distance electric vehicle, but the local electric vehicle. What would happen if the car were actually allowed, particularly the self-driving car, if the self-driving car were allowed to drive itself off somewhere else on the quarter, so that you don't crumb up your small lot with parking cars? I mean, that's a monster. Parking a car with its backup requirements, the width that it doesn't negotiate, its turning radius, really makes a small lot a real problem. What if the self-driving car is a gift to us and it drives itself off to a less valuable parking lot in the sector, where it can park itself at enormously greater efficiency than it can on a single family lot, with a garage and a garage door and all those clearances? What if that car could be taken away so that you could, without any problem, once you've satisfied the appraiser that you have a garage, without any problem, you were to actually send your car away? It's still available on a click in 1 or 2 minutes. Why not do that? Now, that brings up the issue. What about the alley? Isn't the alley really an interesting phenomenon? The alley has no setback requirements. You can run the utilities any way you want. Its only dimensional requirement is the backup of the car. An alley can very easily, technically, be 24 feet. It can be 30 feet, which is an ideal spatial definition. What if we did like what DPZ did way back in Charleston Place, in 1981, our first project, and we called all our streets alleys? Suddenly, all the setback problems disappeared, all the turning radiuses disappeared. We called everything an alley. The utilities didn't have to have separate trenches. It is one of the first things we ever did, is use the alley as something that could actually approach the delicate spatial definition of the European city. Now, once you say the alley is the principal access to the house, why do you need a street on the other side? Why can't it be, for example, a greenway? Why can't it be a bikeway? Why do we always build a street and an alley? What if access were only on the alley, as for example in Boston, on the Mews of London, and the front be a greenway, at least as an option? A greenway where you could bicycle, where you could have the small electric vehicles and so forth. Wouldn't that be an incredible saving? Because of course an alley is much less expensive to build than a street. So there's an incredible amount to be actually worked out here. Now let me give you some numbers. Let us say that in a quadrant or a sector, quarter of a neighborhood, there are 500 units. Okay, at 7 units to the acre, usually it's 500 units. A garage, a 2-car garage for 500 houses costs $22 million to build. $22 million. And by the way, the appraiser can't count it as the sales brochure cannot count it as air-conditioned space. So here the developer has thrown away $22 million. By the way, I'm calculating this at $175 a square foot. And do you know what it would cost to park those cars on a parking lot elsewhere in the sector? Instead of 22 million, it would be less than $2 million, which means right off the bat, you're saving $20 million for the developer. And the garage could be sold as usable space instead of simply as something to accommodate a car that will never be accommodated. Isn't that interesting to do that? And yet, every time I speak to a new urbanist about an electric self-driving car, they say, "Oh, this is horrifying. This is going to actually create. It's going to induce sprawl because it'll be easier and more pleasant to drive distances." So instead of taking the car as a positive, the self-driving car as a positive contribution to urbanism, we take that as simply another huge problem that actually militates against this. And that's only the beginning of many things that have to be rethought about the self-driving car and designing communities for the self-driving car and all the pretty wonderful things that I want to engage today about the self-driving cars. There's hardly a clearest example of the problem with dogma. The fact that we look at this new thing and we say, this is our enemy, when in fact it's probably the greatest thing that's happened in my lifetime to urbanism in terms of solving many of our problems. So there you have the dwelling being actually reversed and having the frontage be the garage. Imagine hearing that from me. Okay. So one other thing, let's move on to the next level. We've spoken about the dwelling. Let's speak about the lot. The lot right now is, the 50 by 100 lot or the 40 by 100 lot, etc. It's very, very inflexible, and it undermines the architect's creativity. What basically you can do is put makeup on it. Yes, everything's given. The typology, the form-based code gives you the shape of the building, and then you get to very skillfully make the porch nicer or the gable nicer or the eave nicer, all the things that the architects have become very good at. Well, what would happen if the architect, instead of being given one lot to design, is always given a compound lot or a flex lot? Now, we've studied very hard what a flex lot is, and it is 1/3 of an acre, and it's 120 by 120. It's incredibly divisible. It easily accommodates from 1 to 6 dwelling units. What if every architect were not given one lot to design, but 6 units, but a lot for rather given instead of given one lot with one unit, in which all he can do is basically do the aesthetics. What if the 120 by 120 lot could be subdivided every which way, or become a compound, or become a pocket neighborhood? What if the architect were able, instead of just doing style, were able to create all sorts of spatial definition internal to that lot? Well, guess what was first done? That was done at Seaside, south of 30A. If you look at the Seaside Code, which actually bears looking at again, look at type 5, and you will see that every lot is approximately 1/3 of an acre, and everything that goes on it is negotiated. And you'll see that there are as many as 8 units and as many as 1 unit, depending on how the market drove it. There's another aspect to this lot. If it is pre-permitted to have up to 6 units on a lot, you create what could be called what Steve Muzon and I call the sky method, which is that every buyer becomes a small developer. So instead of just buying a house and there you sit on it, you buy a lot, you build your own house, and you build five other, whatever you think it might be, could be rental units, so that instead of having just the big developers taking over the industry, which is what they do, why not actually enable every single possible buyer? Okay, and I mean everybody that has a working pen and a working calculator. Why can't everybody become a small developer? And why can't the response to the very delicate micro increments of sociodemographics that Todd and Lori have worked out? Why, we don't design all that delicacy and precision into our unit types, but we can downstream it to individual people. A lot of people, a lot of architects, a lot of people that can do self-building and create their compounds and their small utopias. That would be authentic diversity, okay? Not the kind of diversity we talk about, which is rather cartoonish, but an authentic diversity in the creation of a great deal of affordable housing, highly integrated, and a great deal, I believe, of human happiness. We keep talking about the outbuilding, the back with the granny flat and so forth. No, there's a lot more variety that can happen in basically small intentional communities like co-housing, like compounds of different kinds. Fine, let people decide in the downstream how to build and how to build units that do like that. Okay, so that is what's important about the lot. Make the lot flexible. It's something that we do not do so far. The next thing is the block. Now, if you look at the new urbanist block, it's invariably the long, thin block, not the square block of Hispanic America or French America, but the long, thin Anglo block, which is very efficient. Now we've become skillful at bending it and wiggling it and making it look like it's got some variety. But in the end, it doesn't have variety. We're giving the illusion of variety, the fiction of variety. And as we become bored with the lot and its incapacity to do authentically anything, like how is a long, thin block of 50 by 100-foot lots any different from all the fake facades in the stubby buildings that we hate? These buildings that Dan Solomon calls stubbies. They're just fake facades. Inside is nothing but repetitive apartments. Well, our new urbanist communities with the long, thin blocks, we're very skillful at making them look like they're interesting. We bend them and everything, but really we don't. We're just turning them into sort of graphic art pieces. Not that different, in fact, from Frank Gehry, who just makes arbitrary shapes and everybody says, ooh, isn't that interesting? But it really isn't. It's only visually interesting. There's no actual diversity on it. The one block that has the capacity to do that is the square block. The square block is amazing. It automatically forces you into diversity. And it also allows something. I would always code that a block should have an internal space. One of the problems with the long, thin North American block is that it doesn't have any public space in the center. The public space must always be exteriorized at the level of the quarter. But if you made a square block, it's very easy to preserve a ninth of it. Okay, if you make a 9-square block, in the center, a square open space that actually can be decided by every one of the people working in the block to see what they would want in that block, increasing, again, diversity and actually creating more authentic variety than we do by just simply bending the blocks. Now, I can go on and on about the problem of the over picturesque bent block. I know that my brother Douglas and his Notre Dame studio year after year does brilliant work in the design of picturesque medieval organic towns. It's full of skill, full of rules, as does Leo Creer. But I look at the work of most new urbanists and they're not applying that skill. They're just bending and wiggling and twiggling everything around, including, by the way, often DPZ itself. One of the things that I have found by experiencing Seaside, Rosemary, Alice, Kentlands, Lakelands, and so forth, our communities, is that I am always lost. Even though we designed it, even though I've been there many times, I'm always lost. The level of disorientation is astounding. And I think we have to confront that because while it's tolerable at the level of the neighborhood, it is intolerable at the level of the community. Okay? So that is something that I'd like to bring up. How do we actually reskill the idea of the terminated and the deflected vista? And that, by the way, I'm halfway through this list. I'm going to be moving up, but the time has come to actually take your comments and questions.
Andres, you can talk for another 5 minutes.
Okay, well, the picturesque layouts that we do, the picturesque layouts are okay in communities the size of a neighborhood. Like, for example, yes, of course, I'm lost in Rosemary Beach. Yes, even at Seaside, I have to memorize the houses. I have to memorize the architecture to know where to turn, okay, to know how to find it. But you're never lost for too long because you find 30A. Okay, eventually you find 30A. The medieval cities, yes, you're lost, but pretty soon you hit the wall, or pretty soon you hit the square in the middle. What becomes really intolerable as the project gets bigger and bigger, we create the picturesque layouts are extremely disorienting. Okay, and they're really like abstract paintings. They're not justified. And I would like us to recover at least the following rule. I've just been visiting some European cities, particularly Ciudadela in Menorca, and which is perfectly picturesque. And you know what I realized? I would be looking at a deflected street vista. I would photograph it from above. I would photograph the angle. Never was an angle more than 6% deflection. 6% is all you need to terminate or deflect a vista, okay, within a furlong. So why do we keep wiggling? Why do we do angles of 45 and 30 and 20 when 6% does the job of the deflection? And 6% maintains orientation. You still know that while the vista is terminated, you still know you're moving north, south, east, west. You still know where you are. You don't get lost instead of the continual spiraling that happens. Now, Rob challenged me, and actually Liz Moule also challenged me to list my 25 favorite cities in the United States. I listed 25. 23 were grids. 2 actually were largely not grids. One of them was Annapolis, which actually is radial, and the other one was Marblehead, which is on a very rocky shore and actually just has to negotiate an incredible topography. But all the other favorite cities, and you can look, he wrote an article on this, all the other favorite cities were gridded. What is it that we have against the grid? The grid is incredibly subtle, incredibly varied, subject to termination, subject to all the skills that urbanists can have without losing orientation. And I've challenged DPZ also, and also the rest of us, to do the same. Now, we do have to deal with the problem of wetlands. And that's a war we need to fight, because the only problem, wetlands not only disorient our grids or our networks, but wetlands also actually clip our connectivity to an extraordinary extent. This is something the CNU must take on, or we will be unable to create urbanism itself. Okay, done.
Thanks, Andres. And we have some, once again, please make your comments or ask your questions in using the Q&A function of Zoom. But we're going to get to these.
By the way, that was half my notes. So we need to do
Maybe
it
we'll do another one.
Okay.
One. Okay, so Stephen asks, new urbanism seems to have largely converted the planning profession, but remains a small niche at best in other professions, including engineering, architecture, developers, and financing. What do you think CNU needs to do to get these other professions on board with the movement?
I think that the CNU, for example, the Transect and the Smart Code. Let's first talk about suburbia. It's not just that we're good, it's that suburbia does some things extraordinarily well. All those professions that you mentioned in the suburban system are highly integrated, okay? The densities of the suburban zoning codes, the calculations of the traffic engineers, the sizing of the schools, the recognizable type, the typologies that are recognized by bankers and by retail people. All of these are just, they lock into each other in a beautiful, seamless system. Suburbia is extremely easy to administer and to justify, because every one of those professions that fight us, they interlock with each other perfectly when it comes to suburbia. The Smart Code and the Smart Code Manual was specifically designed to integrate all those professions. Okay, all those professions. The problem is that the Smart Code and the Smart Code Manual have not become the common currency of the new urbanism, because there's a resistance in the new urbanism to hard study. There really is. We're like all artists. There's something wrong with us in terms of actually doing the deep knowledge base that we need to do to be as efficient and as integrated technically as suburbia. Okay? It's not like we haven't engaged this or noticed this before. We do have a solution. And I deeply feel that the new urbanists have not taken it up just for sheer lack of discipline. I don't think we are a profession. I think we're a bunch of amateurs on the whole. Very skillful amateurs. and brave amateurs and willing to suffer, but we're amateurs and we need to professionalize.
So Dave asks, if garages are not designed to store cars, why call them garages? Will building codes and zoning just allow homes without storage space for a car?
Zoning codes are more liberal than you think. The car is required by the appraisers. You see, appraisers are required to find a comparable. For example, if you want to sell a house for $400,000, to get a mortgage, the appraiser has to find another house that sells for $400,000, and it's impossible in the U.S. now to find a house that sells for 400 that doesn't have a 1 or 2 car garage. So this is actually the existence of the garage is required by the appraisals. And the appraiser will not come unless you have the garage. So you have to give that to the appraiser and then move on and get the car out of there after the appraiser is gone.
Hmm. Um, David asks, what would be appropriate dimension for a square block, the length of one side?
Well, there's 200 by 200, which can be studied. There's a lot to be said for 200 by 200 in terms of Portland, but it's not what you think. It's not the walkability. What's interesting about the Portland block is that it has so much periphery for parking that it's basically self-parking. You know, you can park on the street, which is less expensive than building parking lots. That's one aspect of the Portland block. The other thing is that, of course, corners are quite prized, both for retail and for apartments. Everybody loves a corner lot for apartments or retail, and so it increases that. It increases that exponentially, but they're inflexible. There's very little flexibility in the Portland block. Now you get the Mormon block, which is 600 by 600, or 660 by 660 actually, and it's absolutely fascinating because if you actually get to know Salt Lake City, you realize that there's a city which is a crust on the outside, which is actually quite a hard and relatively unpleasant crust at 660 by 660, but inside it's large enough to have an entirely different transect zone. And so theoretically, the larger block can actually have what Douglas calls a rural weave, which is an urban perimeter, an urban crust, and quite a rural interior, so that you actually have the transect in radical adjacency. So those are the two extremes of known blocks, 660 and 400. 400 is a good one because it's just enough to create a space within the block. It's just enough. You get the lots, etc., but it creates a small square that is jointly owned that could be is full of potential of public space, communal space at the level of the block. And as you know, no public space exists at the level of the block. None in the US, you know, except very rarely in very old areas. And I think that actually a block is a very good social increment, and it should have a place in the middle where something can happen in every block. I know that there's one in Atlanta, a friend of mine lives there, and it's a wonderful kid place because they don't go out to the street. So there's 400, let's put it this way. Study the 200 block, study the 400 block, and study the 600 block, and have them all in your repertoire. Because right now, we just default to the 200 block, to the 200 long, thin block with the alley inside, actually 220. We just revert. We never, it's part of our doctrine, is that that's what a block is. And actually, it is, there's a huge book, I forget the name now, but it's 2 inches thick. It's gorgeous, incredibly well documented, and it's called The Urban Block, and all of them are rectilinear. Not all of them are square, but all of them are rectilinear. It's a very, very rich and unexplored technology, the square block.
There was a comment and a question that he says, I think this is amazing and thought-provoking, but somebody attended a lot of CNU conferences over the years, but not in the last 10 years. His observation was that he didn't get this kind of debate. I believe that these types of debates and discussions must be part of all CNU conferences. Is that something that will be implemented? Which, of course, you can't answer, Andreas, but Do you have any thoughts on that for
Well,
these kinds of,
I think it used to be that we would actually drop things in. Like, for example, Peter Calthorpe would periodically, every two or third CNU, would drop in an idea, and there was uptake. We dropped in, of course, the form-based code. We dropped in the transect that said that there was uptake. What I find is different now is that doctrine has turned into dogma, and uptake is very hard to do. Like I've already been talking about mobile homes, for example, for a long time now. There's zero uptake. I have no colleagues that are in the least bit interested in the mobile home because we've somehow been hijacked by some very, very skillful classical architects who actually would like to go back and build in stones if they could, you know. And I think that actually we really have to. There's no reason the CNU couldn't allow presentations like these. The problem is with the membership. The problem is with the doctrine of the new urbanism that has been made rigid into dogma, and I would really do my best to try to break that down.
We have a question from Chris. In a square block, do you envision an alley going to a square center of the block? Is that one form?
No, what I mostly find is there's a block that was invented by Geddes in Tel Aviv, which is a pinwheel block. It was invented in the 1920s. And the interesting thing about the pinwheel is that it can expand in both directions. By the way, you should know that the long, thin block can only expand in one direction, right? It can get longer and shorter, but it can't get wider, without unnatural disruption. And the square block also is rather rigid. It has some advantages. For example, every lot is a different depth in a square block. Every lot is a different depth, which is both an advantage and a disadvantage because it creates social diversity almost immediately. Go look at the plat for Key West or the plats, any plat, New Orleans, etc. You'll see that the plat of the square block causes diversity. But the pinwheel block keeps a relatively steady lot size, which allows you to have model homes, etc., while still able to grow in both directions as required by circumstance. So I'm a great fan of the pinwheel block because of its agility. It's got the strange agility to always respond to circumstance, which is the last thing you would think of a square. Also, the pinwheel block has an easier time actually making the 6% distortions, the 6% distortions that create the deflected vistas. You just have to try them out. Try it out yourself. It's a tool. Play with it, as they say.
Jeffrey asks, there's much attention and recent investment into personalized EVTOL, electric vehicle takeoff and landing. Aircraft used as personal vehicles or Ubers or even buses. Should we consider these as opportunities and move away from our dependency on automobile-based block structures? What are the possibilities with that
Okay.
TOL?
It's tremendous. We're never going to fly on these things, but I think that Amazon delivery to town centers of highly specialized orders. One of the things that I want to talk about next time, which is fascinating, are some things that I've learned in Europe, and also thinking about dark stores and drones and ordering through Amazon, and how the potential of Amazon has made everything less sociable because you can actually have everything delivered to your house and you don't go to the neighborhood store to pick it up. But that can be reversed. And the ability of shops to be anywhere and no longer subject to the old rule of, how many cars per day are driving by, that kind of drive-by retail. I think that if retail can be actually hacked by Amazon, why should we ever place our town centers where the cars are driving by? That immediately creates suburbia. This is a huge topic in the next discussion. But one of the pieces of good news about drones and dark stores and all sorts of things that are happening now, Uber Eats, is that combined, interestingly enough, with Margaritaville, you're not going to believe the eclecticism of these ideas. They're converging on every single neighborhood having viable, highly social town centers in ways that we couldn't do before because our retail could only be in arterials. It's one of the most liberating things that's happened. All these things that we think are bad news, the Amazon, the drones, the Uber Eats, the dark stores, the food trucks, all of these things can be hacked towards new urbanist town center sociability. We need to call them something else. Actually, one of the people I read is Rem Koolhaas. Rem Koolhaas, our arch enemy, is actually our incredible research friend. He calls them epicenters, and it's an epicenter designed by Rem Koolhaas. It's just a different looking Margaritaville, believe it or not. And I think we have to look past the aesthetic manifestation of both Rem and Margaritaville and actually see how the programming really works in those places because they're incredibly social.
Howard Blackson asks, you said how Radburn 2.0 is cheaper than post-Radburn suburbia in 1960 today and leads blocks back to pre-Radburn town planning, 1930s, which was more human than car-oriented. Do you
Yeah.
consider your alley-focused access point more of a baby step to older urbanism or a radical transformation to something innovative?
The
Clarence?
closest thing we have, okay, there's a problem that the new urbanism have had. We've been complicit in this. When we actually developed the critique of suburbia, which is really the critique of the degeneration of Le Corbusier urbanism, we actually made everything that came before us anathema. All that stuff was terrible. We're going to jump past our parents and grandparents and go right back to the 1920s or the 1900s. Okay. And that was very clever because we created a very clear neighbor. Among the things we threw away are two terrible things. We threw away Radburn, which you will see me making a rigorous defense of next time. We also threw away the study of the English new towns. The English new towns, of which they designed, I think, 13 or 14. They built, I don't know, 10 or 8 or 9. The English new towns are 3 generations of modernist planning, of reform from modernism. They all had their flaws, but they all had their virtues. These were very smart people. For example, there's a word, you've never heard of Frederick Gibbard. Frederick Gibbard wrote the best-selling book for 2 decades in terms of the critique of modernist planning and the proposals for the 3 generation of British new towns. He was, of course, it's a dorky book. Of course, the architecture was deficient, but it was brilliant as a first generation hybrid critique of modernism. The last new town, the one that was canceled, was called Hook. Hook Newtown is closer to anything that we're designing now, that DPZ is designing, than anything that came before. Hook Newtown, because remember, we're not the first reformers. And not only that, but the British new towns had 3 generations of reforms, and we never looked at them. Not a single new urbanist that I know ever looked at Frederick Gibbard's book called Town Design. You should get over the graphics, get over the photographs, and see what he was trying to do. It's incredibly more stimulating than actually reading more about new urbanism or medieval cities. Okay, there's enough drawing plazas. How many plazas are we going to draw? How many books on the size of plazas, in the Southwest or Europe or all over the world? It's totemic. What are we doing drawing plazas? As if we draw a plaza, somehow everything's going to be solved. It's not. It requires a lot of rethinking. And Frederick Gibbard is an amazing book. And you have to hold your nose. You cannot go to Margaritaville, okay, and understand anything if you can't get past the architecture or you can't get past the kind of people that go there. But just look at the sociability. We have to open up and find success wherever it exists because we need that DNA very badly. We're terribly inbred.
Lindsay asks, what is your response to the fire code officials regarding fire suppression in a neighborhood of alleys? And if all the homes are sprinklered, aren't the cost savings lost?
What happens is that the alleys, the fire, you just follow what the fire rules are. Um, the fire engine needs 20 feet and the alley's 30 feet because you want a little landscaping. And by the way, many of the mews in London are 30 feet, so there's no problem there. And then that square in the middle is the exact turning radius of the fire engine. That's it. You hack the system. You don't fight it. We're tired fighting systems that we've lost. There are battles that are lost. We lost the battle with the fire chiefs. It's lost. It's completely lost. We had heroes, we had sacrifices, we had kamikazes, we had projects that died, on the basis of the fire marshal. We lost. Let's admit that we lost, and let's move on to the next battle. And basically, what we do is we meet the fire code. It's not a battle we do anymore. We just fight it. Now, as far as the sprinkling is concerned, it's a complete waste of money, and that is just part of the corruption of lobbying. We don't need sprinklers, et cetera. By the way, there's a couple of things we have a beef with. Do you know that if you read the Wall Street Journal this morning, I think it's the Wall Street Journal, the greatest bugaboo now is mold, black mold. Everybody in Florida is talking about black mold. Okay, it's not fire; it's black mold that's killing us. Just read the article. Do you know where black mold comes from? The highly sealed houses of LEED. Those hermetic houses full of insulation, guess where humidity goes and you can't get it out. So now our new, if you care about these things, LEED is not our friend. LEED is our enemy in every possible way, okay? And it is not part of our toolkit to actually do what LEED does, but it is part of we have to engage them so that our houses aren't full of mold, so we can open windows, and so we can have shaded streets. One of the things I'm going to talk about next time is a very interesting criteria that DPC used to do back in the 90s. We used to orient our towns. We used to do solar orientation for our grids. When was the last time you heard about that? Right? I mean, there's so many things we used to do. The type 5s at Seaside, the solar orientation of our grids. We dropped too many initiatives as we became fascinated by reducing tailpipe emissions, okay? And there's another thing I want to speak about next time. The whole problem of gentrification. Is it really a problem, or is it actually one of our greatest assets? I'd like to engage that straight on, because there's no reason to apologize for the gentrification that takes place in our new urbanist communities. And the answer that you're going to get from me, the reasoning is not what you think. Okay, it's not what you think. It's not defensive. It's actually aggressively positive. So yes, we need to there's new wars to be fought, new battles to be fought, but sometimes you have to give up on the ones that are lost.
Okay, we have hit the 1 minute point, and we are going to post this video on YouTube tomorrow. But we can continue to answer some questions. There are some good ones. Steve Muzan asked, delighted you've come around on deflections. I found the 6 degree max in traditional deflections, whereas 15-degree deflections look like 90-degree intersections on the ground.
Yeah.
In that long ago conversation you had with Steve, you said, our clients insist on sexy plans and satellite views.
Right.
What brought you around?
It's so interesting. It's so interesting. First of all, I wasn't clear there was just 6 degrees. It really had to do the empirical. SketchUp was really good, as we experimented. But I just couldn't stand taking clients around in Rosemary Beach and being lost all the time. It was literally existential. I was lost all the time. I've always been lost in Rosemary Beach, and it's not even that complicated. Then I realized how utterly, utterly excessive it's become. Now, that doesn't mean that if you are a great artist and almost like a great musician, like the Douglas Duany's studio at Notre Dame, if you're that good and you're as good as a set designer, so that every deflection, every recession, everything is perfectly, then that's worth it. Okay, if you're going to live in a work of art it's worth suffering for it. But none of you are going to just kind of, wiggle and shake to please the client. You just have to fight him on that. By the way, if you put 6% anywhere with SketchUp, they will see exactly that it does the job. It just does the job. I know what you mean, Steve, that they're not paying. They'll say, what am I paying you for? A grid? And we need to formulate what the answers are. We need to give the examples, and we need to actually really get very good about terminating. I was just in an incredible city called Ciudadela in Menorca, one of the best I've ever seen. Do you know they don't use any deflections or hardly any? Every block is slipped slightly, so every vista is terminated, not deflected, terminated. There's always a window at the end looking down the street, by the way, doing a very good job on supervision. And the grid is maintained, but the vista doesn't go on forever. I never actually realized that you can terminate every vista just by slipping the blocks, 50 feet or so, and retain orientation. That was another one of these aha moments.
That's an interesting idea. Um, Bob asks, how can we promote sociability? Why does it work in social media, but rarely in real life? Ross Chapin says that the scale of sociability leans toward neighborhoods of 12 households or less. And what about promoting name tags?
Okay, two things. I'm not surprised at the 12 or less, but what I would say is that if you have a strong enough theme, let us talk about the compound, in which actually there's a proactive gathering of the 12. Okay, let's call it the gathering of the 12. Why can't you find a frat boy from Vanderbilt and say, hey, you're retiring. Why don't you take your 12 best friends from Vanderbilt, from your fraternity, and get it together and create that wonderful period of your life, instead of just stumbling along with somebody? And these are called intentional communities. Believe it or not, golf course communities, which are, I could hardly be more bored by them, are intentional communities. And everybody who goes to a golf club is like everybody else that goes to a golf club to some extent. But you can also make a community for car collectors. You can make a community for ex-airline pilots. There are lots of veteran communities that are actually dedicated, quite sociable, because they have enough of a theme that like-minded people meet each other. There is this bears study. There is a lot of what I would call, we need the terms, okay? There's something called a social condenser. A social condenser. Do you know what is a social condenser? That stunned me. There's a place I know in Buena Vista, Colorado, that has seven concerts every year. Buena Vista is in the middle of nowhere. It has 12 concerts, and I say, with 12,000 people, 7 concerts with 12,000 people. And I say, how do you gather 12,000 people 7 times a year? Aren't they the same people? Don't they get tired? It says, no. You select the music precisely to attract a certain cultural segment, and they get along beautifully. They have a blast for 3 or 4 days. They come in, they tent, they pay a fortune to come in from all over the world. And you know what actually makes them alike? The music. The power of music to gather people, the way it's used in the villages in Florida, north of Orlando, the music from 5 to 8 in the evening in the 3 town centers, each music being different: rock, folk and country. Okay, rock, folk, and country. People gather and they socialize like mad. I think one of our tools needs to be music. Every day, music, and people know where to gather at the town centers at the same time, and the socializing is mad. It's wonderful. So anyway, that was another of the aha moments I had, is the power of music integrated into urbanism.
Somebody asked, with the rise of affordability as the top political issue with regards to the built environment, many housing advocates are suggesting supply should be prioritized over design. How should new urbanists respond?
By the way, I do agree with that. I do agree. I think actually, one of the things I learned a long time ago, a very long time ago, is that the present is a distortion field for urbanists. If you design for the present, you can't be an urbanist. You can be an architect because you can deliver your product within 3 to 5 years, but an urbanist delivers 34 years out. So you have to speak to very young people. And one of the things I'm beginning to realize with young people is that highly styled architecture is a little bit like aggressive marketing. Like almost like wearing a logo. This is my Gucci, whatever. Uncool, uncool. That's the Xers. They do that. Maybe the Z, but the Zs aren't going to do that. Okay. And so what happens is there is a neutrality to the architecture that is looking for a name that I would call matter of factness. Okay. It's a German term, matter of factness. The last code I wrote, and by the way, the client didn't accept it because he thought he wasn't getting his money's worth. I said the architecture should express durability and shading. Durability and shading. That's it. That's all I said. And you know what? You could test it. Test it. Give it to 10 architects and say, your only expression is going to be make the thing look solid so that it looks like it's going to survive a hurricane. This was a Florida project. Okay, just work with solidity, thickening the walls, brackets, etc., and shading. All sorts of shading, the richness, the architectural potential of shading. And then the third thing I was going to add, you must integrate landscaping into your buildings. My favorite architects working now are called Lake Flato. They're in Austin. Lake Flato are incredibly good architects. Just try to get their books. And you will see, once you're alerted, you will see that every single design for a house or a building they do, right from the beginning, first minute, they design the landscape with it, integral. And it really makes a difference. We design the houses, we worry about the bathrooms, we worry about the square footage, we worry about the orientation, the light, the kitchens, the mudroom, all this stuff. And when we're kind of nicely done, we put the landscaping in, usually pretty skillfully. They don't do that. They integrate simultaneously the landscaping with the building in all sorts of ways. And actually, their buildings are very neutral. They're the closest thing I know to this matter of factness as a term. It's looking at, like I said, matter of factness is a very good word in German. It's not a good word in English, but I think it breaks the expectation. We're looking for something that is actually laid back. Have you noticed how laid back the people are, the young people? Have you noticed how laid back they are? Have you noticed how they get frightened if anybody my age gets excited? They think we're having a fight. They think I'm having a heart attack just because I get excited, with another guy my age, okay? They just want to be laid back. They want to be left alone. They're having lunch. They don't want to be interrupted by the brilliant architect everywhere. Thank you very much. Can you leave me alone? I'm having lunch. Why do I have to admire you all the time? Why do I have to look at your moldings all the time? Why do I have to look at your axes all the time? Can I just have lunch? Get out of my way. I feel that deeply. I'm getting sick and tired of admiring architects. I wish they would just calm down. By the way, this is not minimalism. It's harder than you think. It's not minimalism. There's one thing I want to add to this. We have to learn, the architects do, how to do repetition beautifully. When you look at 6 or 7 houses by one of our brilliant architectural firms in New England, et cetera, and you see them do 5 or 6 or 10 houses with slightly different pitches and slightly different porches, and you know what I mean. It's a lot of skill to do that. You get nothing out of it. It's nothing but fake. Yeah, we know it's the same house, got dressed differently, different makeup. It's not exactly lipstick on a pig, but it's lipstick on something, okay? Can we just look at repetitive housing? Can we look at the Danish housing? Can we look at the dormitories at Harvard and Dartmouth? And can we look at the New England houses with the same window, 10 over 10 over 10? Can we possibly just settle down and learn the beauty of repetition? Okay. And there's a lot to be learned there. I've been studying that for a while. repetition is deadly if it's precise. One of the things that the Scandinavian architects and the vernacular knows is repetition with precision is deadly. But repetition with slight variation, with imprecision, is wonderful. Urbanism, the architecture of urbanism, is necessarily repetitive. Stop trying to hide it. Look at the English terraces. Look at the terraces in Boston, the terraces being the townhouses. Look at any big building or any urban building which is repetitive. Look at the mills. Look at all these things and learn to do it so that it's not frightening. Because we need to do that. We can't just keep designing, special editions of everything. Six building types with 6 facades with exactly the same program, exactly the same square footage. Like, what the hell are we doing? Can we just settle down? And with repetition, by the way, one of the things that Henry Ford realized very clearly, and there has been no pickup, is that you cannot get economy unless there's repetition. You can't. You can cheapen materials, but the economy is about doing the same thing over and over again. And I think we need to settle down and learn how to do that again. It certainly exists in history.
So, what are the best models for suburban density? It seems that new urbanists completely ignore this portion of the transect rather than finding good spatial forms at this density.
Okay, couple of things. Why? Let's go back a little bit. What did the new urbanists contribute? Before we did our job, and this is very clear on the Florida coast, there were 2 types of buildings. Buildings that sold big yards. Okay, you either bought the yard or you bought a view. Like, for example, if you were to look at Orlando in its early days, you would see this very weird urbanism. You could also see it in Canada, north of Toronto. I remember seeing this. You would see houses and 10-story buildings. Houses and 10-story buildings, nothing in the middle. Because what was sold was yard and view. What the new urbanists contributed is the missing middle, which is density. But guess how we justified density? We said if you do density, you get urbanism. So now we have 3 points. There are 3 amenities: view, long view, big yard, and street life. What doesn't work is density without street lights. Okay? If you do density, you absolutely have to do urbanism first rate, walkable city, lots of activity in the town center, because you're not getting a decent view and you're not getting a decent yard. Now, there is one thing that's fascinating. Colin Rowe, the great professor at Cornell, in a throwaway line said, somebody asked Colin Rowe, he said, what is your favorite city? And he answered, out the front door, London, out the back door, Los Angeles. Okay, check that out. What he said is, I want to go out the front and find urbanism, and I want to go to my backyard and find a beautiful pool that's private. Wow, really interesting. Wouldn't that be ideal? Both. Most of the time, suburbia does neither. You get neither the urbanism in front because of the 25-foot setback, nor do you get the privacy in the backyard because of the typology. Do you know what the solution is? The courtyard house, the patio house. Now, the new urbanism has had a professional deformation because it came out of New England in a kind of weird way, okay? It has a lot to do with Vincent Scully, had to do with a lot of the early new urbanists went to school in the Northeast. And so we tend to do houses. First of all, we do we do narrow, deep lots. You know what the narrow, deep lot gives you? No privacy whatsoever in the backyard because you get other 5 houses looking at your pool, okay? No matter how high your fence is, the other long, deep houses are looking at your pool. Out of the South, Florida, and out of California came the wide, narrow lot. Much more interesting, the wide, narrow lot. You know, the ranch house, which is wide, narrow, shallow, wide, shallow. The New England lot is narrow, deep, and you know, we all designed that, right? But what we never do is the bungalow, the narrow that can actually approach the front. It can have a much shorter setback in the front, and a much better yard in the back because it's wide. You can have a pool. Very interesting. But you know, the real key, there's another tradition in this country, which is the tradition of the Southwest, which is the courtyard house, the patio house. DPC introduced the patio house gradually, and finally it culminated in Alice Beach. Alice Beach is primarily courtyard houses on 40-foot lots, okay, and 35-foot lots. They're 100% private in the backyard on a 40-foot lot because it's a patio. We coded patios. Do you know what the lots sell for there? 40 by 100? $3 million without a view. Do you know why? Because privacy in the backyard is an unbelievably valuable amenity. Only the wealthiest people with the largest lots in America have authentic privacy. Well, in a 40 by 110-foot lot, in Alice, you can get privacy in the backyard, and people go crazy over it. And the density, and people don't realize this, but you know, these three communities of ours, these three experimental laboratory communities, which are resorts, Seaside, Rosemary, and Alice, are actually each one denser than the next. And the only difference is that we got better and better in securing the privacy of the backyard. So each one is denser, each one is more private, each one sells for more per square foot. I think the new urbanism should commit, just learn the courtyard building. You can find it in Antigua, Guatemala, very clearly. It's not unknown. You can also learn quite a lot of it by visiting North Africa, which is where Rome survived. You know, Rome survived. The domus, the Roman domus with the courtyard, survived in North Africa. It went to Spain with the Muslim invasion, and the conquistadores brought it to the Caribbean, where it came up through Colombia and Mexico, and finally landed in Florida, believe it or not. Okay? That's the actual cycle of the courtyard house. Rome to North Africa, to Spain, to Colombia, to Mexico, to Florida. And right now it rests in Alice and Rosemary Beach, there to be taken with incredible privacy in the backyards. And that's how you achieve density, not by punishing people, but by saying, we are going to give you urbanism out the front door and an incredibly private backyard. It's really a utopia. Incidentally, if you raise density too high, you don't get diversity. Do you understand that the reason that we always end up with about 7 units to the gross acre instead of higher is that if you want diversity, you can't just build a place that's all apartments or all townhouses or all single family houses, right? You know, yeah, oh sure, you and I can do, we can easily do 30 units to the acre and hide the parking, but that's not diversity. That is actually a complete cultural, it may be an economic diversity, but it's a cultural monoculture, okay? So the key is not to increase density. That's where the tailpipe emissions cause the deformation. The key is not to increase density. The key is diversity. And every one of the transect zones requires a percentage of apartments, townhouses, and houses, precisely because that is the socio-demographic segments that Todd Zimmerman and Lori Vogt always write up.
I'm going to ask
ahead.
one more question, and we have many others. Unfortunately, we're not going to be able to get to all these.
Can you save them for next time?
Yeah, I mean, we can. Yeah, we can probably save them, and we can probably people can ask them next time. But Jeffrey asks, architecture may be a boring topic here, but other than porches, how has new urbanist architecture become dogmatic?
Well, you can always, let me put it this way, okay? I track the work of the good firms. There are a lot of sort of middle-aged, if you consider that I'm old age, there's a lot of middle-aged firms, some younger firms. I can't tell the work apart. And I'm pretty good discerning differences. I cannot tell the work of the firms apart. And they're very good I mean, can you tell me there's a better firm than Tortigalis? Is there a better firm than Union Studio, right? Is there a better firm that Southern, whatever, I forget what they are. Is there a better firm than Steve Mouzon? No. They're no better. They can't be better. But somehow they've converged on something so similar that when you look at the renderings, you cannot tell authorship. That's what I mean by the loss of DNA. There's been a great loss of DNA. And for example, if I were to actually say, let's do a research project, I would begin by studying the bungalows. Just pick up Ernst, whatever his name was, May's, M-A-Y was his last name, book on the bungalow from 1940. Okay? The American bungalow. Just pick that up and see what you can get. There's an incredible amount. And there's one thing that I might actually add. You've got to open up the possibility of the single story city. There's a lot to be said. This is anathema for the single story city. Just study it. Give it a chance. I've been studying it for 15 years, a single story city. What are its consequences? What do you get? In fact, it does incredibly good things. The single story city. It's much less expensive to build a single story building. It's much more private. Et cetera, et cetera. Okay, this is not the time to say it, but why don't you look at a rendering of that's called in John Repp's book called Los Angeles in 1874. There's a beautiful aerial rendering of a single story city, which is LA. Now, I'm not saying that we do single story cities, but when you need a redress in which the ideal is 3 and 4 stories, in which our glory renderings are always 3 and 4 stories, well, we need a redress of single story. We need to rehabilitate the single story, and then the 2 story, the partial 2 story, and the periodic 4 story. And I can go on and on about this, but you're not going to do it just because I say it. Just study something new. Okay, you guys and girls, just don't do what you usually do. Just study. I remember the first time that Teofilo Victoria told me, have you studied the single story city? I thought he was insane. Okay, I understand how you feel when you first do something that completely cuts across your doctrine. I understand what it feels. It makes your teeth hurt. It makes Teofilo look like a person that just wants to be interesting. But I always take the challenges seriously, and I give it a chance. And it takes a while to understand just what Rem Koolhaas is saying about the epicenter, just what the single story city like Antigua Guatemala is like, which, by the way, requires a visit. All these things that go to Margaritaville. Just hold your stomach, don't throw up, and see what they're doing well. Okay, make your own conclusion about how is it all this horrifying aesthetic. Why is it so sociable that such a horrifyingly unaesthetic, disgusting place is doing so well? Study it, because it doesn't have to be bad design. There's something about the software, there's something about the programming, there's something about the management that really works in these places, and we need it. We cannot, somehow, I believe there are quite a few of us that believe that beauty is sufficient. Oh, it's beautiful. Well, you can't live on beauty. You can't. You've got to have a lot of other things. And it may not be anything you like, but we're not designing for ourselves. We are not the end users. Our clients are not the end users. The people who commission us are not the end user. The end users are people we don't even meet down the line, who go to the sales office. Are we providing the happiness for them as self-defined? As self-defined, not what we think is right or wrong. I think we owe them that. We owe them to understand, at least to enable them to have happiness as self-defined.
Well, thank you, Andreas. This has been a wonderful discussion, and we've done a good deal of talking. And
keep the questions. Keep the questions. Okay, let's do another one.
Yes, okay, we will do another one. This has been fun, and thank you everyone for your great questions and for being part of this and listening to this. Have a great day.
Bye.